our formalities first. My name is Alina Gilbert. For those of you who don't know me, I will be doing today's webinar. It is the Help We Can't Get Volunteers for the Board. Now, this is actually our last educational event for 2020. And so we don't start back up with education until 2021. And so that'll be in January. So it's kind of bittersweet. So just FYI, our education for 2021, it's already all up on the website. You can go and sign up for whatever classes you want. As with this year and COVID, we obviously may still have to convert some of our lunch forums into webinars. And if that's the case, we'll just go with the flow and we will do that. But everything is up, the topics are up, and you're welcome to go browse and sign up. I believe you can sign up for any class as long as it's within 90 days. But enjoy, go forth. So it is 12 o'clock. And as always, oh, I have a question. Will we still get monthly reminders for all the classes? Yes, you will. We will not stop doing that. You will keep getting the monthly reminders. So no worries there. While I read off our housekeeping items, enjoy Scruffy the cat. All right, so for those of you who have not joined us for a webinar in the past, as I said before, I'm Alina Gilbert. I'll be presenting today, and that's me in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And the majority of the screen really should be the PowerPoint presentation and Scruffy right there in the middle. And then on the left, you will see there's an opportunity to ask questions. Now there's two tabs you can go under. One is a question mark, and one just looks like a little bubble for, you know, a statement. If you guys could all just use the question mark one, because I always forget to check both of them. So if you have questions, I'd really appreciate it if you could put them in the question mark tab, because that's the one I've got pulled up, and I'll try to remember to check the other one at the end, but it'd just be easier if you put everything in the question mark. As far as CMCA credits, they are automatically generated. You do get them emailed. You should have them within a couple of days. If you don't see them pop up by Thursday or early Friday, please let us know. And there's a couple ways you can let us know. One is you can call Sean Sanders, who is our education coordinator. His office line is 303-991-2076. Or you can send an email to Sean at ssanders@altitude.law. Okay. If in the meantime you are having any problems as far as technical difficulties, I encourage you not to type anything in the questions tab because there's nothing I can do about it on my end. So I would recommend you call Sean's number, again, 303-991-2076, so he can work with you directly and figure out what the problem is. All right, now if you put them in there, I'll stare at it and kind of just shake my head because I won't know what the issues are. That being said, I think we are ready to move on. Type your questions in as we go. This is an interesting topic because I think a lot of it is more kind of what I call a soft topic versus legal topics. Certainly we're going to talk about some legal requirements and things like that, but I think a lot of this is also being creative. And so I'm going to encourage you, especially towards the end, to type in things under the questions tab. Your experiences, what has worked for you, what hasn't worked for you, because I think we can definitely all learn from each other. This really is kind of a sharing of ideas for this type of a class. So without further ado, let's get started. Why don't people volunteer? I think it's really important to start with that question. You know, before we get into the how do we find people and nobody cares, I think it's important to look at the underlying reason. I think we all really know what the underlying reason is, I mean, certainly if you know, being on the board of directors paid tons of money and, you know, was a prestigious position and people loved you for being on the board, I think we wouldn't run into this issue, but clearly we all know better than that. So, you know, there's a lot of different reasons people don't get on the board, but I think these 5 bullets kind of hit it on the nose. Some people just don't care, right? Don't know, don't care to know. I will send my monthly check-in. Otherwise, I don't care. There's not enough money in it, right? Because the salary is so high and then we double it every year. There's not enough money, and some people, money is the trigger and they want to be compensated, and there isn't any compensation other than the love of the homeowners, and that's not going to be enough. They're not masochistic enough. And yes, it's funny, but it's also true. I mean, I think with many boards, people, when they get on the board, maybe they don't realize it right away, but some do, that, you know, there is a lot of criticism that comes with being on the board. People are blaming you for everything. People are yelling at you. They're calling you names. They're accusing you of things that are just awful. And if you're a masochist and you enjoy that kind of thing, great, but most people aren't, right? So again, people don't want to subject themselves to that kind of treatment. Why would they? I'm not upset enough to join the board. In other words, why would I be on the board if nothing is wrong, right? Something has to push me to want to get on the board, because right now everything's fine. So not upset enough kind of goes with the next bullet, which is pocketbook not impacted. It's not, you know, the assessments aren't going up. Everything's status quo. This isn't touching me as a homeowner. So I have no incentive to want to get on the board. There are, of course, lots of other reasons people don't get on the board. But like I said, sum it up for the most part. And so, you know, when we talk about finding people to serve on the board, it's important to first try to figure out what's going on in each community, why people aren't volunteering. And sometimes it's just the, you know, we don't care, it's apathy. Or sometimes it is, I would volunteer, but, you know, everything's going great. We haven't raised assessments in years, I'm happy, you know. So try to figure out kind of in each community why you think people are just not excited or wanting to get on the board. All right, so this then brings us to the next question, and this is something I think all community managers worry about at some point or another. I think board members worry about this. Well, what if all the directors want to resign, or all but one resign? What happens? What do we do? What does this mean? And that's scary. And yeah, it is scary. And there's really like 3 main points I want to touch on when we talk about directors either resigning or threatening to resign or submitting their resignations. The first one is fiduciary obligations. So it's important to remember board members have a fiduciary obligation to act in the best interests of the community and not in their own personal best interests. If we have, for example, a 5-member board, 3 of the directors resign. Now we got 2 directors left, and they both want to resign too because they don't like being the only 2 people on the board. I think they need to understand that because they're the last 2 standing, if they both resign, there could be a breach of their fiduciary obligations, because I don't know in what reality having no board of directors to make decisions is a good thing for the community. So if I'm the last board member, all my fellow board members have resigned, and I'm still on the board, and I'm thinking, I don't want this pressure, I don't want to deal with this, I think it's important for me to understand that if I resign as the last board member, I'm basically saying there's no one here to make decisions for this community. This community is not going to be able to function, and I don't care because I don't want to be on the board. So on some level, we are talking about a fiduciary obligation of a board member. And so if you're the last man standing or you got 2 people left, be careful. There could be a liability exposure. for those folks to just resign without doing something to get someone else in that position. The other thing that comes up a lot is, you know, we had a 5-member board, 3 people stepped down, we have 2 people left, we don't have a quorum. Okay, what do? Can we still function? Can we still do things? So the first thing to look at is, what is a quorum of the board? There are a couple options. Sometimes it is the majority of the total seats on the board, right? So the total seats is 5, a majority is 3, so a quorum would be 3. Sometimes it's a majority of the directors that are on the board, which means it's a majority of who we have. So if we have 2, that means both have to be present. So that's the first question you should be looking at. What is a quorum of the board? What's required? And can we still comply with it? Let's say we cannot. We do not have a quorum. Then first look at your documents. And usually it's going to be in the bylaws. But look at your documents and see if there's a provision in there. There's a provision in there that talks about if there's less than a quorum of board members remaining. Okay. Can we still operate? So look in your documents first. However, even if your documents are silent, the Nonprofit Act has 2 wonderful provisions that are really helpful to us. And the first one says if you've got less than a quorum of directors left, okay, the remaining directors, even if it's just 1, can still fill vacancies. And actually, I see a comment here. It says the remaining board members should be able to appoint members of the remaining terms of the prior members. Yes, that's absolutely true. The Nonprofit Act says even if you don't have a quorum, you can still fill those vacancies, whoever's left on the board. However, as the title of this webinar suggests, we can't get volunteers for the board. What do? Right? We got 2 people left, quorum is 3. What do? Again, we go back to the Nonprofit Act, and it actually has another provision that talks about emergency powers of the board. And emergency powers are, it's basically when we can't get a quorum because of some emergency. Now, the word emergency isn't defined, so I suppose someone could argue that people resigning is not an emergency, but I would argue that it is, because if we don't have a quorum and we can't make decisions, something very bad is going to happen with the community, and therefore it constitutes an emergency as far as I'm concerned. So that provision of the Nonprofit Act says that the board has emergency powers, even though there's less than a quorum, to take action in good faith to further the ordinary business of the association. So that means whoever's left on the board, even if it's 1 person, can still make decisions so the association can keep functioning. So that means that even if I can't find someone else to serve on the board with me, I can still sign checks. I can still sign contracts as the remaining board member. I can still do all the things that a board would do, except I'm just 1 person. And I think one thing that I've seen associations do when they've had 1 person left on the board is the board members send out a letter to the community saying, hey, do you really want me to run this community myself? Do you guys trust me enough to do this? I'd prefer to have some, board members with me to do this. And sometimes that actually works because they're like, oh my God, we have a dictatorship. We have 1 person running everything. Oh no. And people tend to freak out, and then they're like, well, I better volunteer. So again, less than a quorum remaining, not a problem. I mean, it's a problem because we don't have enough board members, but it's in the sense of the legal ability to conduct business. You can still conduct business. What if there's a mass exodus? And I know this is things that I have talked to various community managers about, who say, what do? I am the manager. I have no board. What on earth am I supposed to do now? And I think part of that certainly depends on the specific management company and whether or not you guys have your own internal processes or requirements or things that you have to do based on company policy. So absent company policy, I'm going to say, as an attorney, if I was looking at this, I would say there's really no way to do the kosher thing. In other words, board members are the only ones authorized to make decisions. Community managers are not authorized to make decisions on behalf of the board, but you execute the decisions of the board. You provide advice, you help, you organize things for them, but you don't make the decisions. However, I think when you have this kind of a situation, what I've seen happen is I have seen some community managers organize a homeowner meeting. Now, again, this is all pre-COVID, of course. It's much harder now with COVID because you'd still have to do everything electronically. But I've seen community managers organize meetings. They basically send something out saying, we need a board, we have no board members, please come, we need volunteers. And they create what we call a makeshift board. So it's not, obviously, again, it's not like completely kosher because it's the manager who sent out the meeting notice, not, the secretary of the board. And we kind of just have these volunteers show up that weren't elected. But once you have this makeshift board, then that board can make a decision to hold like a formal meeting with elections and kind of get everything back on track. So I have seen that happen, but I also have seen some community managers say, there's not a board, we're out of here because we don't have anyone to take action from and we're not going to expose ourselves to liability. So again, it just depends on kind of what your management company dictates with these types of situations. All right. Before we start searching for candidates, again, this is all before we start, looking. We got to know who's eligible for the board. So who's eligible? Homeowners, residents, they have to be in good standing. Well, you have to check your bylaws. Oh, and by the way, this the picture here for the board of directors, I don't want anyone to be offended by it. I'm not at all suggesting that anyone's an ass. I just thought the donkeys were super, super cute and it fit the title, board of directors. So please don't take offense to that. Just enjoy the cuteness of the donkeys. All right. So when we look to see who is eligible, what we're really looking for is what do the bylaws require for a person to be able to run for the board. Under Colorado law, there are no requirements to run for the board other than you have to be an individual. An individual, what, I can't tell you, but you have to be an individual. That's it, okay? So if your bylaws and your other governing documents say absolutely nothing about eligibility, that anyone can run for the board. It can be Joe the garbage man. It can be someone's third uncle once removed. I mean, it can be anybody. They don't have to live in the community. They don't have to own in the community. They don't even have to have anything to do with the community. So you need to check your bylaws, but I would also recommend you check your declaration and your articles of incorporation because ideally the qualifications should be in the bylaws, but I think we all know that oftentimes we inherit governing documents that's not the case and things are kind of all over the place. All right, so check the governing documents and see what you need for someone to be on the board. Now, a couple of things to look for. One thing I hear all the time or get questions about all the time is board members, sometimes community managers, assuming that you have to be in good standing to run for the board. Like, we don't have to, we can prohibit someone from running if they're delinquent, right? Or if they're in violation of the covenants. Well, the answer is it depends. It depends on whether the governing documents speak to it. If they don't, then no, they don't have to be in good standing. They can have an active lawsuit going against the association and they can still get on the board if your documents don't require good standing. So don't assume that that's a requirement. The other thing is sometimes you'll see a requirement that someone has to be an owner, and sometimes you'll see an owner of record. So an owner of record means your name is on the deed, and the deed is recorded. So let's say you have a husband and wife, and the house is in the wife's name, right? So her name is on the deed, but the husband isn't. So, and you have to be a deed holder to be on the board. Obviously, we're going to say, well, the wife would be eligible, but the husband would not, even though they're going to say, but hey, it's a, common estate, we're married, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. The documents require what they require. So keep an eye out for those kinds of things. But generally, know who you're looking for before you start looking, because you don't want to waste your time reaching out to people who may not be eligible to be on the board and trying to get them to get on the board, only to tell them, oh, no, you can't be on the board. Psych, just kidding. All right. So now let's talk about incentives. And again, this is where we get creative. And I've got a few things listed in this PowerPoint, but I suspect all you community managers and board members out there have tried other things that have either miserably failed or worked miraculously. And I'd like you to type some of that in if you don't mind. But let's talk about the incentives I have first. So send a scary letter. Scary is in quotes. But, for those of you who know me and have attended my classes in the past, you probably have heard me say fear is a wonderful thing. And I don't mean it in a bad way. I mean in the sense of, certainly we don't want people to be afraid, but fear prompts people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. And if we need people on the board who aren't willing to volunteer, sometimes fear is the one thing that can change that. So what I've cut and pasted for you here, in this slide and the next slide, is actually a portion of a letter that was drafted by our office a while ago for a community where they asked us to basically send a letter to the homeowners explaining that somebody really needs to volunteer for the board. So this is some of the verbiage from it, and it says, volunteers are needed to serve on the association's board of directors to ensure the board is appropriately constituted and can continue the association's business operations. So far, so good, but not very scary. Then it says, as the association's business can only be conducted through the action of the board of directors, it is critical that the association maintain a functioning board. Without a board of directors, the association cannot make decisions or take action. So all of those things stated here are absolutely true. But I think the scary part lies in, well, what happens if we can't make decisions and we can't take action because nobody volunteers? And that's this next slide. And it says, okay, so that sentence is repeated. Without a board of directors, the association cannot make decisions or take any action. And then it says, if no functioning board is in place, and I know you can read this, I'm just trying to kind of speak it out. It is possible that a court would appoint a third-party receiver to operate the association's affairs. So that's kind of the fear factor, I think, there. And then it says, if a receivership is necessary, this could result in significant costs to the association and its members. Therefore, it is imperative that individual members volunteer to ensure that a functioning board of directors remains in place. So you can see how this is kind of trying to be a little scary and getting people to think about, oh no, what happens if I don't volunteer? We're going to have this third-party receivership person come in and do everything. Personally, I think the letter could be scarier. I think it could go, more into all the horrible things that could happen if there is a receivership, and kind of what will happen to the community and what will happen to property values and things like that. So this is just an example of a letter. Now, certainly because it came from an attorney, we would have to be very careful in what we put in the letter. But I think if it comes from the board itself or the remaining board members, I think you can put scarier things in there. So keep that in mind, is again the fear factor thing and sending the scary letter to all the homeowners. Could it be an email? Sure, I guess it could be an email as well. So don't assume it has to be snail mail. It's just sending that message. All right. Incentives, knock on doors. Again, not during COVID, right? We were very limited in what we can do when it comes to like in-person things with, you know, all the COVID and the new flare. So can we call people? And I know nobody likes to get on the phone and just call people and be like, hey, you want to volunteer for the board? But, you know, that's certainly something to consider. Can we email people? And with this, I think it's going to be more targeted. It's not like we call every single owner in the community or we email every single owner in the community. I think it's going to come down to people that we as in the board or maybe the community manager that we know in the community that we think might be interested in getting on the board or running for the board or might be a good addition. So this is a specifically, you know, targeted activity where we're not just sending out to everybody saying, someone please volunteer. This is us proactively reaching out to specific individuals saying, hey, are you willing to volunteer? We really need you on the board. And so sometimes when it's targeted, you know, it's harder for people to say no when you're on the phone with them or you're emailing with them, or you're standing across the street yelling, hey, you want to be on the board? It's harder to say no when someone is directly coming to you. So again, that is something to consider. All right. Threaten to raise assessments. People laugh when I say that, but I think you also realize that it's true, right? I mean, yes, I'm not saying it's the ideal way to get volunteers because you'll probably get some angry volunteers in that case, but it's certainly a way to get people's attention. It's easy to ignore something until it hits your pocketbook, and then you're not going to ignore it usually, right? So if you either threaten to raise assessments or you do raise assessments, people are going to come out of the woodworks. And they may come out of the woodworks and yell at you and scream at you and say, I'm not getting on the board, but I'm going to yell at you. But they may also come out of the woodworks and say, well, I think I can contribute to this and I think we can keep assessments down because I know people who know people who know people. I mean, you know how that works, right? If this is something you are considering, doing, just make sure you are following the appropriate processes to increase assessments, because some associations most associations do have to go through the ratification process, and some associations actually still have a consent process. So make sure you know what you're doing. And maybe I can just for a minute get off topic here as far as board members, because I do want to talk just super quick about raising assessments and your budget ratification, because right now everybody's having their budget ratification meetings. This has recently come up quite a bit, at least for me as an attorney. So I want to just speak to it quickly. There are quite a few attorneys in this industry, and obviously we don't always agree on how things need to be. One issue that has come up is the question of, can we ratify the budget through a mail ballot? And I know there are some attorneys that say, yes, you can. I just want to let you know that this firm's position is that, no, you cannot. And the reason is because if you look in Kiowa, there is language that says the board has to adopt a budget. Not within 90 days after the board adopts a budget, it must schedule a homeowner meeting for consideration of the budget. Okay, so you have to schedule the meeting. It doesn't say, but you don't have to schedule the meeting if you do a mail ballot. It doesn't say that. It says you must, that's part of the process of the budget ratification. You must schedule a meeting. And then further on it says, the budget will be submitted to ratification at that meeting. Okay, so I don't think that there is an opportunity there to be able to approve or ratify the budget via mail ballot. I think it has to happen at a meeting, and that meeting can be virtual, and that's fine, but there has to be a homeowner meeting. And again, I realize there's perhaps other attorneys out there that say differently and interpret that provision differently, but I think that is very risky to interpret it differently when it flat out says you have to have a meeting. You have to call the meeting as part of the budget process. All right, I am done with that, so let's move on. Again, so assessments, that was the incentive. What's next? Compensation. So a lot of times people say they have this kind of visceral reaction to compensation. It's not allowed. It's prohibited by law. It's not prohibited by law. In fact, the law says directors may be compensated unless otherwise prohibited in their bylaws or their governing documents. So if you don't have a specific prohibition in any of your governing documents, then it is permissible to compensate your board. The question becomes, how do you compensate the board? All right. So how do we compensate the board? Great question. So some associations will do a stipend. Some associations will just say, oh, we give them gift cards, like once a month, they get a $100 gift card somewhere. And then I have some associations say, oh, we're just going to either reduce or tell them they don't have to pay their assessments. And as you can see, there's a big no, it's underlined, it's all caps. 99% of the time, you're not going to be able to do that. Why can't we do that? Because if you look at your declaration, one of the things it talks about is the allocated interests, which is how do we calculate assessments, right? That's a definition of allocated interest. It's three things, but one of those is allocation of assessments. And most of the time when you read your covenants, it'll say, you know, regular assessments are paid equally, or there's a formula which ends up, you know, 1 over the number of units, which is still equal. And sometimes it'll say based on the allocation set forth in Exhibit A of the declaration, which is usually some sort of a table that gives you allocations, percentages, what each unit is responsible for. If you reduce assessments or tell board members they don't have to pay assessments, you are flat out violating this requirement because you are not following the specific allocated interest requirement, because you're not paying, because the board is being allocated either a smaller share than what the declaration says or no share at all of the assessments. Okay, so do not reduce assessments as compensation for your board members. The only time I would say maybe is if you have a specific provision in your declaration that says, as compensation for serving on the board, assessments may be reduced by, you know, whatever, 10% to each board member. In over 20 years of doing this, I've never seen that, but I never cease to be amazed. So who knows? Maybe it's something like that is out there, but chances are you're not going to have that in your documents, but definitely check. But just remember, there's creative ways to compensate, but you cannot reduce an assessment. All right. And then I also want to talk a little bit about the unintentional consequences. I think anytime a board does something, it always needs to think through of, okay, what are the unintentional consequences we may have as a result of this? Well, I think when you compensate board members, there's usually going to be, by someone at least, a perception of impropriety. It's going to look bad. It's going to, a lot of times homeowners get offended. Like, you're supposed to be volunteers. You're supposed to be working for our community, not for a paycheck. So why are you getting compensated? Tends to happen. Sometimes it makes people suspicious. Well, if you're getting paid, what else are you doing with our money? Are you raising assessments so you can make more money? I'm sure you've heard this before and you've seen this before. So I think if a determination is made that board members should be compensated, I think the board also needs to have a way of either communicating that or having a plan in place where it's going to address some of these unintentional consequences. And it could be more than a perception of impropriety. There could be something else. So think it through. I don't particularly myself like the idea of compensation, but I think it sometimes is the only way to get people on the board, and it definitely should be considered as an alternative. All right, out of the box ideas. So I've chatted with people in the past, and I've had, a couple of interesting things come up. It was the wine and cheese party, again, pre-COVID. So what does that mean for us in this day and age? I think I've seen associations do like virtual happy hours with homeowners, where it's virtual and you can join and we talk about stuff and it's really just for fun. And I think if that kind of a thing works in your community, there's a turnout, that might be, an opportunity for, if there's, board members in that chat to say, hey guys, anybody thinking of serving on the board? We got, 3 positions up. We had people, get off the board. They all sold their home and there's only 2 of us. There's only just me left. Anybody want to come join the board? I think sometimes that's a good opportunity. Normally I say, when you got the wine or a beer or whatever else people are drinking, they seem to be more accommodating and more agreeable to join the board. Wonder why that happens. So if you do a virtual happy hour, maybe that's the way to go. The other thing I've seen, which I think is pretty cool, is honoring past board members and their contributions. And I actually saw this happen about, I want to say 2.5 years ago. Before, like I said, pre-COVID, when there's still, we were doing our physical meetings. It was an annual meeting, and the board president at the time for this community was stepping down. And he had been on the board for several years, and he really was a very good board president. He was a good leader. He did a lot of things for the community. There were some homeowners that didn't like him, as you would expect, but he was a very good president. And what the community did, and he didn't know about it, but what they did was they got him this like giant plaque with his name and like, thank you for your service. And then they got him a couple other things. And I could tell when they presented it to him, he was extremely touched by it and very grateful for it. And, the community was touched by it. And I think that led also to more people wanting to get on the board, because they realized, hey, this isn't like this thankless thing, right? People can get recognized, and and their contributions can get recognized, and so I can make a difference if I get on the board, and I can contribute to the community, and people will appreciate it. And I think sometimes that is the main thing that our boards lack, is that they're just not thanked for what they do for their communities. They're only criticized for the bad stuff, but they are never thanked for all the hours they put in and the contributions they make. Because I think if we had that, obviously we would have more people volunteering. And then what else? I'm seeing some folks already sending in their examples of what's worked, and that's great. I'm going to get to it because we have so much time still. But this first, I want you to look at this. It just makes me laugh every time. Because I remember when I was a kid, my parents were like, you're in front of the TV too much. You're going to get antisocial. And now it's you're on your phone too much. You can get antisocial. So it just makes me giggle a little bit. All right, so let's go ahead and start going through all the stuff you guys submitted, because I think there will be some interesting suggestions here. Would you provide your permission to lift your statements on pages 5 and 6 with full attribution to you? Oh, yes, that's fine. No problem at all. The remaining board members should also be able to appoint members. Yep, we touched on that. Can we still get the reference documents you are speaking about? So I was speaking about the Nonprofit Act, which you can download on our website. We have the full Nonprofit Act, and also Kiowa, the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act. Those are both on our website. You are welcome to download it, print it, do whatever you want with it. As far as the covenants are concerned, those are separate. Those are different for each community. So each community has its own set. So you would have to get, that from the specific community. What about a receiver? Yes, we talked about that, right? I served as one for a community that had no board. Exactly, and that was exactly what was threatened, so to speak, in this attorney letter that we read through. There could be a receiver. I think if you served as a receiver, Gary, maybe add a comment here and let us know kind of how that turned out for the community. I think that would be interesting for us to read about or hear about. Life, be on the board as long as only one is an officer, and will they both get a vote on the board? So again, absent anything in the governing documents that limits, one person per household or one owner per unit to be on the board, then there's nothing prohibiting a husband and a wife from being on the board together. And it really doesn't matter if they're both officers or they're not officers, or one's an officer and one isn't, and they will both get a vote. And I've seen that happen, and it's usually the other board members and angers homeowners. And so my personal preference is that if you're, updating your documents, that you say only one owner per unit can be on the board at any given time. Okay. What happens to insurance and mortgages if in the receivership? That's a good question. I don't think necessarily anything happens to the homeowner's individual insurance policies or mortgages, but I think it also depends on what the governing documents say and what they provide, because sometimes older documents, you see provisions that say if something happens, then all the mortgagees must be notified. And those are very cumbersome provisions, and I suspect most associations don't comply with them if they have them. But you got to see what your documents say. All right, at our HOA, recruiting board members became easier after a couple of owners took advantage of a leadership vacuum to control the board and start doing things the community didn't like. Hold on. The community didn't like. So my message in other situations would be, don't wait around until bad things start to happen before you decide to get involved. That's great. That is definitely a good message. Kind of like right now, everything's great and it's not impacting you, but it will. It's coming. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So don't wait for the when to happen. Let's avoid it altogether. Get on the board. Absolutely. Very good. Worked with a board who had a dinner for the board members and their significant others, the manager and maintenance team at the end of the year. I have actually worked with a few boards like that, that do that, and I think it's a very nice gesture. I've had a few boards that did that where the homeowners kind of raised the stink about it because they thought that's not an appropriate use of association funds. So, if you're going somewhere that's not super expensive, I think that's one thing. If you're going to a $200 a person plate restaurant, I think that's something else. So just be careful with those things, but I think it's a good idea. Is the webinar recorded? Yes, it is recorded. It will go on our YouTube channels along with our other webinars. Probably in the next, I suspect we'll get it up by Thursday or Friday at the latest. So if you go on our website and you go to the education tab, on the right side, on the right side, there's actually a list of things, and there's a link to our YouTube channel. You can click on it, and you'll have all our webinars there. The board walked off. Management company spent months convincing a judge to appoint a receiver. Once appointed, I was empowered to hold a meeting and election. which had to be continued due to the lack of quorum the first try. Surprised? We got a board elected at the second meeting, full of the non-compliant folks, and I think the manager lost the account. I'm now offering receivership services. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That is definitely very interesting. So yeah, not a great thing to get a receiver appointed. Hold on, I think we have some. All right, here we go. I knew there would be some questions here, and I remembered to switch over. Right. If a board needs to fill a vacant position, must they accept anyone who is interested? Absolutely not. It is up to the remaining board members to determine if someone who is interested, even if they're the only person interested, if they're a good fit. So you don't have to accept anyone who happens to show up, but at the same time, I think you have to be reasonable. And if we're desperate to get someone on and we only have one person show up, we should have a really good reason why we wouldn't take them on the board. And it can't be something like, I don't like them. You know what I mean? Or I don't agree with their positions on things. It would have to be something more than that. So just be reasonable. Question on budget ratification meeting. When owners veto a budget, is it based on all the owners or just the owners present at the meeting? So under Kiowa, it's based on all the owners. Kiowa says, unless a majority of all owners veto, and then it says, or a higher number required in the declaration. So if you have a declaration that says 90% of all owners must veto the budget, then it's that number. If the documents state non-delinquent owners cannot vote, does that power have to be enacted and the delinquent owners notified before nullifying their vote? I think that also depends on what the documents say. A lot of times it'll say you can automatically take away their vote. You don't have to notify them. Sometimes it says you have to notify them. So you have to look at what your documents require. There is nothing in state law that says you have to notify them. But again, you're always going to hear me say that. You got to be reasonable. So, you know, if you have an opportunity to notify them, maybe notify them. But if your documents specifically say you don't have to, then certainly it's a board to make that determination. Is it wise for the board to serve on the ARC as well? I actually would recommend to have at least one board liaison on an architectural committee, because committees, for the most part, serve at the pleasure of the board and they report to the board. And the board then determines who's on the committee, who gets off the committee. So you need to be able to kind of follow what the committee is doing. And so I would recommend at least one board liaison serving on the committee. Can a husband and wife be on the board as well? Okay, yeah, so we read that one already. Ratifying by ballot. What if your documents say anything that can be conducted at a meeting may be conducted by mail ballot? So that is exactly what the Nonprofit Act says. It says anything that may be done at a meeting may be done by a mail ballot. And so again, the question then becomes, does that override the specific provision on Kiowa? It says you must call a meeting and the budget must be ratified at that meeting. I don't think it does. Plus, if you have that in the Nonprofit Act, Kiowa does trump the Nonprofit Act if there's ever a conflict. So even if we consider that to be a conflict, Kiowa would trump. So I would take the position that, no, it doesn't matter what your bylaws say because Kiowa requires this. All right. Hold on. I'm going to go back to, all right. If the documents state oops, let me get up, dancing fools up. If the documents state non-delinquent owners cannot vote, does that power have to be enacted in the, oh, no, we already read this one. Okay. All right, you know what? I think I'm actually done with all the questions. So I will give you 1 minute in case anyone else has any more questions to type under the question mark. But if there isn't and there aren't any more questions, I just want to say I hope everyone has a very safe and healthy holiday season. And I'm glad you were able to join us for our last educational event of the year. And I hope everyone has a very, very happy holidays, whatever you celebrate. Thank you, and we'll talk to you next year. All right.